Good morning. This week marks the 531st anniversary of the landing in the New World of the three ships commanded by Captain Christopher Columbus, sailing under the banner of the Crown of Castile, the predecessor of the modern Kingdom of Spain. In 1934, the Wikipedia article on Columbus Day tells us, as a result of lobbying by the Knights of Columbus and a New York Italian leader named Generoso Pope, Congress passed a statute stating the president is requested to issue each year a proclamation, one, designing October 12th as Columbus Day, two, calling on United States government officials to display the flag of the United States on all government buildings on Columbus Day, and three, inviting the people of the United States to observe Columbus Day in schools and in churches or other suitable places with appropriate ceremonies that express the public sentiment befitting the anniversary of the discovery of America. That was 89 years ago. Legislation to create Columbus Day as a federal holiday was signed by President Lyndon Johnson in 1968 to be effective beginning 1971, celebrated on the second Monday in October. So Columbus Day has been celebrated as a federal holiday for 52 years now. Beginning at the end of the 20th century, though, a number of states began to drop the observance due to wider recognition of the disastrous effects Columbus's landing had on the indigenous people in the Americas. The states of Hawaii, Alaska, Vermont, South Dakota, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of California, including Los Angeles County, do not recognize it and have each replaced it with celebrations of Indigenous Peoples Day. Last year, when I went to the Middleboro Public Library to borrow a book to learn about the impact of Columbus's arrival, I noticed a sign posted on the door telling me that the library would be closed on October 10th to honor Columbus Day. I was a bit surprised and disappointed as I think of the library as one of the more progressive institutions in any town. This year, there is a sign on one of the doors listing all of the days the library is closed for this fiscal year, and sure enough, Columbus Day is listed as one of them. There's another sign on the other door, though. This one, in full color, proclaims that the library will be closed on October 9th for Indigenous Peoples Day. That's progress. The book that I used for most of the information for last year's sermon on this weekend was Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. If you were here, I'm sure you remember the emotional impact of this history, if not the details. I knew after reading what I did for that sermon that I would never celebrate Columbus Day again. Till the end of his life, Columbus believed that he had reached the Far East, the Spice Islands of Asia, the land Europeans knew from the accounts of Marco Polo in the 13th century. He did not reach the Indies, but landed in an island in the Bahamas, and then explored Cuba and Hispaniola. History preserves the illusion, though, by calling the islands he explored the West Indies and the inhabitants Indians. And his legacy? As a colonial governor, Wikipedia tells us, Columbus was accused by his contemporaries of significant brutality and removed from the post. Soon after first contact, we are told, Eurasian diseases such as smallpox began to devastate the indigenous populations. Columbus participated in the beginning of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, which involved brutally treating and enslaving the natives in the range of thousands. Columbus Day remains widely celebrated and will continue, no doubt, to be one of the battlefields of the cultural wars now besetting the country. But more and more, in progressive enclaves and elsewhere, the negative effects of Columbus's voyages are being recognized, and the pre-Columbian culture of the indigenous peoples is being honored and celebrated. We have to be careful, though, when we use the term indigenous culture or indigenous people. That's why we pluralize it, because there was no one indigenous culture. I remember learning 30 years ago that there were upwards of 300 Indian tribes. Research has continued, though. Now 574 individual tribes have received federal recognition. These tribes vary in their languages, laws, religious customs and beliefs, celebrations, dietary practices, traditional clothing, and art forms. There is no single Native American culture. The European settlement of the Americas introduced Western cultural practices and ways of being in the world that were often radically opposed to Native American understanding. An essay from the website Versopolis states what most of us already know, but can well be reminded of. The relationship to land has been an essential quality which indigenous peoples have always honored and respected. For the Western mind, from the old Greek philosophers onwards, including the Christian view, a different attitude towards nature has dominated. Nature was something that needed to be subdued and was subject to utilization. It was even regarded as in opposition to culture. The only acceptable non-industrial use of nature was the admiration for its beauty. But again, that was only as a sanctuary for the human mind, a place to find inspiration and recovery. Nature on its own premises was not a concept to be assessed. It was a wilderness where predators roamed. It was something to be scared of, and therefore required regulations. For those of you who took Philosophy 101 in college, think back on the opposing views of Rousseau and Hobbes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French romantic, viewed the natural world as a paradise from which we had grown apart. Thomas Hobbes, the Englishman, famously referred to life in the natural state as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Neither philosopher had much experience on the subject on which they expostulated, though. Native cultures in the Americas were anything but solitary. The culture was tribal. In tribes, the cultural roles might feel too strictly circumscribed for most of us. Women prepared the food, which in some cases could be a long, laborious practice. Boiling or roasting corn, then pounding it into mash, which is then eaten or baked into bread. But women's duties were essential: manufacturing weapons and tools, maintaining the roofs of homes, gathering and cultivating plants for food and for healing, making clothing, curing meats and skins, tanning hides. Some of these traditions were absorbed by the Europeans who settled in the Americas and have come down to us today. Today, we take the cultivating of corn as a crop for granted. It's planted as a single crop, often across acres, in a monocrop agriculture, a practice which will inevitably drain the earth of its renewing properties and which involves the application of large amounts of pesticides. Native Americans, as most of us know, planted it as one of the three sisters, along with beans and squash, a practice known as companion planting. The corn stalks provide the pole for the pole beans, which pull nitrogen from the air and bring it to the soil, benefiting not only the bean plant, but the corn and the squash as well. The large leaves of the squash protect all three plants by creating living mulch that shades the soil, keeping it cool and moist and preventing the growth of weeds. The squash leaves are so prickly that they tend to keep away raccoons and other mammals that might be tempted to feast on the plants. Some American gardeners, the wise ones, have adopted this practice, the planting of the three sisters, a legacy of indigenous people. We take corn for granted now when we can buy it for 50 cents an ear in the supermarket in the summer, though rarely without genetic modification, a subject for another day. It took Native Americans generations to cultivate corn through selective breeding. Thousands of years ago, the plant we recognize as corn was unrecognizable as such. It was a plant called teosinte, a wild grass. A teosinte ear is only 2 to 3 inches long, with 5 to 12 kernels. Compare that to corn's 12-inch ear that contains 500 or more kernels. Teosinte kernels are also enclosed in a hard coating, allowing them to survive the digestive tracts of birds and grazing animals for better dispersal in the wild. But for humans, the tooth-cracking coating was undesirable, so it was selectively reduced and reduced and reduced until all that remains is the bit of paper-thin, translucent tissue that sometimes sticks in our teeth when we munch on a cob of corn. Selective breeding by Native Americans is responsible for our enjoyment of hot, buttered, sweet corn today. In other indigenous peoples' agriculture news, more than 3,000 years before Charles Goodyear invented, or at least got credit for inventing, vulcanization, the Olmecs were making rubber in what is now southern Mexico in 1600 BCE. Spaniards arriving in the 1500s wondered at this strange material and described their technology for processing it. Latex, drawn from local rubber trees, was combined with the juice of morning glory vines until it coagulated into rubber. Rubber balls, Converse sneakers, Chuck Taylors, Air Jordans, none of these products at the heart of American culture could have been possible without the experiments of Native peoples patiently cutting latex bleeding notches into rubber trees and mixing the fluid that emerged with morning glory vine juice. As for transportation, the Inuit in the Arctic developed a concept of a small, narrow boat with a sealed cockpit to protect the paddler from sinking in the event that the craft capsized. This, according to Canadian technology historians David Johnston and Tom Jenkins. These classic vessels were fashioned entirely from natural materials with wood or whalebone frames covered by stitched sealskin or other animal hides. Today's kayaks in use across the world are usually built from modern materials, but the design is still the same. Think of the fun you've had paddling on a lake or stream or river or even an estuary in the summer, and take a moment to give thanks for the ingenuity and skills of generations of Native Americans. Summer also means sunglasses. And in snowy climes, the glare of sun off an expanse of snow means that you need sunglasses then too. In fact, Inuit people suffered from snow blindness until they figured out the source of the problem and improvised a solution. The predecessor of our modern sunglasses are goggles fashioned from wood or bone or antler or leather, which were invented to protect eyes from overexposure to sunlight. Native people cut a slit in the material, wood, bone, antler, or leather, which simulated squinting. This also cut down on the amount of ultraviolet light that the eyes were exposed to. Thank the Inuit for sunglasses. The original Ray-Bans banned the sun's rays. Raised bed architecture Agriculture has become more popular in the past 30 years, but it's an old technology, if you want to call it a technology. Raised beds can help the health and productivity of a vegetable garden. If your soil has poor nutrients, or is too wet, or is too compacted, or the drainage is too poor, or it's loaded with nematodes or other garden pests, a raised bed is often the answer. Improving the soil by enriching it, improving the drainage and aeration, will increase quality and productivity. And there's less bending for those of us with problematic backs. A raised bed is framed with lumber and is usually 8 to 12 inches deep. It's constructed above the natural grade of the soil. Natives in South and Central America invented the technique of enriching soil and piling it to build raised garden plots called chinampas on swampy lakes, swampy land, and in lakes. When you think of a cable suspension bridge, you probably think of the remarkable Brooklyn Bridge, the first steel wire suspension bridge, built in 1883 and considered a marvel of architecture, engineering, and planning. Or you might think of the Golden Gate Bridge, constructed in 1937, and from 1937 to 1964, the longest suspension bridge in the world, and even today is the tallest suspension bridge in the United States. The engineering that made possible these remarkable achievements in transportation was pioneered by the Inca of South America. They figured out how to weave mountain grasses and other vegetation into cables, sometimes as thick as a person's body, and then use them to build super strong suspension bridges that spanned across gorges. Some of the structures spanned longer distances than anything European engineers of the time could construct with stone. The last of the ancient Inca-style grass cable suspension bridges still exists. It spans a gorge in Peru's Canas province. Every spring, communities gather to take part in a ceremony of renewal. Working together from each side of the river, the villagers run a massive cord of rope more than 100 feet long and thick as a person's thigh across the old bridge. Soon, the worn structure is cut loose and tumbles into the gorge below. Over 3 days of work, prayer, and celebration, a new bridge will be woven in its place. The Keswachka Bridge has been built and rebuilt continuously for 5 centuries. That's humbling, isn't it? What else do we have to thank Native peoples for? How about baby bottles? The Iroquois took dried and greased bear gut and added a nipple fashioned from a bird's quill to create bottles that could be used to feed infants, according to Iroquois historian Alan C. Parker. Anesthetics and topical pain relievers. In what is now Virginia, natives used jimson weed, a topical analgesic, grinding the root to make a plaster that they applied to external injuries such as cuts and bruises. Healers also had patients ingest the plant as an anesthetic as they set broken bones. Long before ether or sevoflurane, desflurane, or isoflurane, another native remedy for pain and inflammation was tea brewed from the bark of the American black willow, which contains the chemical salicin. Once it gets into the body, salicin produces salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin tablets. What about the syringes used to inject the anesthetics? Native Americans fashioned syringes from animal bladders and hollow bird bones to inject medication. According to Technology in America, A Brief History. The technology didn't show up in European medicine until the 1850s, when a Scottish physician began using needles to inject morphine to relieve pain. Tomorrow is Indigenous Peoples Day, It might be a good time to sit with children or grandchildren and tell them some of these marvelous inventions and begin to instill a sense of gratitude for the legacy of America's indigenous peoples.